must admit I'm a little bit nervous today because I only have so much time to get you to 1975. And 3 lectures on the Vietnam War is clearly not enough. But please remember that this is not a comprehensive tour de force that concerns all of the aspects of the war. This is a very, very brutal, violent war. Many millions of people will die in it. And I want us to keep that in the back of our heads, so to say, because this is not really the subject matter. What I want to focus on here is to have us understand how we are framing the war in spatial or mapping terms, and how that is oftentimes obscuring rather than illuminating the nature of the war and what was going on the ground. Okay, so just to set myself up, we were in the mid-1960s last week. We got to the mid-1960s, but just to set myself up again, to focus us on the main subject matter of this lecture series is to repeat where we are and how we got to the 1960s, and that is to remind ourselves that there are 2 Vietnamese states. One set up in 1945, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, here in black, right, so the outline of Vietnam in black, claiming all Vietnamese authority and as the only legitimate government of the country, and through the French political maneuverings, there was a counter-state set up, the Associated State of Vietnam, in 1949, with the capital city in Saigon as opposed to Hanoi, and its outline is in red here. So you see it's the same outline, it's all of Vietnam. So it was set up as a counter-government that did not recognize, obviously, the Democratic Republic. It also claimed sole legitimate authority over all of Vietnam. And so if we want to talk about a division of Vietnam in political terms, then it is not Geneva 1954, as all the American discourses make us believe. It is, in fact, the political division goes back to 1949, where 2 similar states emerge with exclusivist claims to representing all of Vietnam. And I spent quite a bit of time last Thursday on talking about the Geneva Accords and what they meant to the end of the French-Vietnamese War. Basically, two major outcomes of the Geneva Accords. One was to establish 2 separate military recruitment areas or zones at the demilitarized zone at the 70th parallel, in which the contending armies would retreat. So these were military recruitment zones. And they were not meant as political borders, because neither of the 2 states, neither the Democratic Republic nor the Associated State, would agree to a political division. That was a fundamental belief of Vietnamese nationalism, that Vietnam was indivisible. It would not be divided again into 2 separate countries. So please keep that in mind. The DMZ not as a political border, by agreement of Vietnamese, even if they were mortal enemies to one another. And then there was the provision of having elections that would reunite the Vietnam winner take all. So the Associated State eventually would go up against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. We all know from last week that this does not come to pass, because the leadership changes in the Associated State of Vietnam, and ex-Emperor Bao Dai is replaced in sham elections by the new leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, who immediately abolishes the Associated State in 1955 and instead declares the Republic of Vietnam. So the Republic of Vietnam is in 1955. Again, the capital city is in Saigon, but again, we don't need to change the mapping, the red outline, because the Republic is a successor state to the Associated State of Vietnam. It also claims sole legitimate authority over all of Vietnam and does not recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So we are still in that situation where the DMZ is not seen as a political border. We have 2 exclusivist and eliminationist states facing each other, albeit now under in the kind of limbo state where the southern-based state, the Republic, denies holding the elections because they know they would lose them. Okay, so that is the setup of post-1954, and in the first few years, the two contending states have, of course, de facto control over their military recruitment zones. And they get to work. They are consolidating power, they're establishing authoritarian dictatorial regimes in each of those two zones. So those who are opposed to the communist-led Democratic Republic in the northern zone have a very difficult time. And similarly, loyalists to the Democratic Republic that had remained in the South also will be now on the receiving end of state-organized violence by the Republic. So in the late 1950s, in this period where there is no open warfare, but state consolidation by both of these contending states, we have de facto control of these two zones by the two contending states. So in this case, our map is pretty accurate. Right? We have two clearly demarcated zones, and it's homogeneous control, so to say, by a southern-based state of the southern zone and homogeneous control by the northern state. But it changes because Vietnamese who were exiled in the north from the south, who had regrouped to the northern zones, are, of course, horrified to see the violence against their loved ones and their supporters in the south, and they are lobbying the northern-based state to resume armed resistance in the south, and only that is allowed and permitted and then organized in 1960 with the establishment of the southern-based National Liberation Front. So these are southern guerrilla fighters, oftentimes called Viet Cong in our discourses, southern-based guerrilla fighters that are loyal to the concept of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as the only legitimate state of Vietnam, so loyal to the vision of a revolutionary nationalist state. Now, with the establishment of the NLF in 1960, things changed very rapidly in the southern zone of Vietnam, and that is the Viet Cong, the NLF, makes pretty rapid gains in the countryside, indicating to me that they are, particularly among the rural population of the South, there was quite a bit of support for the revolutionary state, for the Democratic Republic, and they did not recognize southern, particularly in the countryside, southerners, the legitimacy of the republic. And so what happens is pretty quickly in the early 1960s, we have areas of the southern zone that fall under what I would call revolutionary control, where the NLF is now commanding quite a bit of territorial control in the south. And so this is just, of course, a kind of symbolic rendition of what is going on, but let me just bring this up from where we left off last Thursday, and our CIA map coming up right now, so which shows the southern zone of Vietnam, which was under full control of the Republic until the early 1960s, and then here in early 1963, we already have in pink large areas of the southern zone that is under NLF control, in other words, under the control of those who are loyal to the northern-based Democratic Republic. And 2 years later, when the Republic is in even greater political straits, dire straits, you see that the CIA map is, which I think is brutally honest because it is a highly classified map, so there's no reason to pretend. So in 1965, that CIA map shows even greater acquisition of control of territory by communist or revolutionary nationalist forces, and in blue that is the territorial control of the Saigon-based Republic of Vietnam. Right? So the republic that claims all Vietnamese authority, that had de facto control south of the DMZ until the early 1960s, has now lost a lot of territory south of the DMZ and is reduced to what I would call an archipelago state. Okay? And that reflects, of course, also the de facto spatial control during the last years of the French-Viet Minh War, when revolutionaries were in control of about 80% of the countryside of all of Vietnam. And slowly but steadily, we are going back to this kind of de facto control of territory. Now, I want to hasten that this is not an invasion from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. So I want to talk about the rhetorical setup for the Americans when they enter the war. And they enter the war for good by the early 1960s, because the American project, as Americans have intervened in Vietnam, the American project is to have a stable and viable South Vietnam that can hold the line at the DMZ against any further communist advance. So this is the American project. It is not necessarily, the Americans are not considering using ground forces to go north, because it was very clear that they did not want to provoke communist China, which had made it clear that it did not want to have American forces on their border. But it is the project of having a viable South Vietnam, quote unquote, that would hold the line against communist advances. That triggers American intervention in the early 1960s, just as the Republic loses ground in the countryside. So Americans are sending up to about 24,000 advisors to the Republic, mainly in military capacities, or military advisors, to try to stem the tide of increasing territorial control by the NLF in the South. Okay? Now, so here we are in a situation where things are getting more complicated. We have two Vietnamese contending states that claim all Vietnamese authority, but de facto, the southern-based Republic has lost more and more territory, even in the southern zone that it initially had control over. It has become more of an archipelago state of disjointed territories, mostly the towns and cities of the southern half of the country. But now we also have a third layer of rhetoric imposed on this conflict, which is the American one, which creates the notion that there is a discrete division at the DMZ. Right? That there is a North Vietnam duly constituted in 1954 and a so-called South Vietnam duly constituted in 1954, and they are separate entities, they are discrete countries, and therefore the United States is intervening to help South Vietnam ward off that communist insurgency. So from that moment on, we are led to believe in this kind of narrative that is set up, that frame that is set up of a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam, and South Vietnam is now under attack from North Vietnam. We are led to believe that South Vietnam, so to say, is a passive victim of Northern Vietnamese aggression. Right? The more we get into the war by the mid-1960s, the more the American framing takes over of a North Vietnamese aggression against quote-unquote South Vietnam. But let me remind you, and I want to show you some visuals too here, that the Republic was not South Vietnam. It never had the identity of being only South Vietnam. And in fact, when I say these were exclusivist, eliminationist countries, states, that goes for the Republic as well. And let me go through these very quickly here. I want to show you two images from Saigon. So here, this is the Republic of Vietnam. And in the middle of the main square in Saigon is a big propaganda board with the flag of the Republic, a yellow flag with 3 red stripes. And it says in Vietnamese, the whole people in solidarity to defend the southern zone and to liberate the northern zone. Okay, so here, this is probably in the mid-1960s, I would say, maybe 64, 65 or so. And it was a billboard that was up for a long time. So you see here that in public pronouncements, the Republic itself also had a military and political goal of ultimately moving north across the DMZ, destroying the Democratic Republic, and uniting Vietnam under its Saigon-based rule. This is something that in the American framing of the war is simply not coming out, because Americans say, we are defending South Vietnam from a North Vietnamese aggression or invasion. Right? So as if they were two discrete countries and the South was kind of a passive peace-seeking entity. Here you see that going north and uniting Vietnam under a Saigon-based regime and destroying the Democratic Republic was part and parcel of the setup of the Republic. And here is a stamp, 3 dong, stamp of the Republic, so Vietnam Gong Hoa stands for the Republic, and again you see the yellow flag with 3 red stripes, and you see that people are planting this flag in an imagery that recalls Iwo Jima, the famous scene of the American flag being raised over Iwo Jima. Here the Republican flag is raised over the northern half of Vietnam, marked in red for the communist control. And again it says, the whole people in solidarity to prepare to march north. Okay? So even in the mid-1960s, and I would say even into the late 1960s, the Republic of Vietnam was making very public pronouncements that ultimately its goal was to destroy the Democratic Republic and to move north. Similar to the Democratic Republic, of course, saying the very same thing. They wanted to destroy the Republic, the Saigon-based Republic, and unite Vietnam under its communist-led rule. So here to basically give you an example of, to prove to you my argument that the reality for Vietnamese was that they were two contending states, eliminationist and exclusivist. Right? And the American framing of North Vietnam versus South Vietnam is obscuring that particular reality. The final example that I want to give you about the intentions of the Republic is also what leads to the next stage of American involvement in Vietnam. Remember that from 1961 on, Americans were involved as advisors to the Republic, but things get worse. By 1963, internal divisions in the body politics of the Republic lead to a great amount of instability, political instability in the Republic. The so-called Buddhist crisis, I don't really want to get into that today because it's not germane to my focus. But Nguyen Diem becomes, from an American point of view, and also from the point of view of many of army officers, the officers who are leading the army of the Republic, he becomes untenable. He is jeopardizing the chances of a republic for survival, and he has to be overthrown. And so in late 1963, in fact, the army of the Republic is staging a coup d'etat with American knowledge, with American green light, against the leader of the Republic, who is being killed in that coup, Nguyen Diem. And we talked about Nguyen Diem last Thursday quite exhaustively. Now, the Americans had hoped that giving ARVN officers, ARVN generals, a green light to overthrow their civilian government in Saigon would stabilize again the situation, but that is far from the truth. So instead of stabilizing the situation, the Republican political scene is spinning even more out of control. By early 1964, the project of an American supported stable anti-communist state south of the DMZ is in imminent jeopardy. NLF is making use, of course, of the political turmoil in the Republican-held cities and is gaining even more ground in the countryside. And there is a real chance that the Republic might collapse in 1964 from all these contradictions in the countryside and also from within. So the Americans are planning to intervene now directly. American forces are needed to hold the line against further communist advance, right? To rescue the American project in the Vietnam War. And this leads me to briefly talk about the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. And many of you will remember that incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident happens in August 1964, and it involves American ships that are patrolling off the coast of the northern coast. So these are American ships that are patrolling up there. They are, of course, gathering intelligence, and one of them is attacked in August 1964 by torpedo boats of the Democratic Republic, the USS Maddox. And 2 days later, it is joined by the USS Turner Joy, which in fact is in Bremerton. If you're landing with your ferry in Bremerton, you see a cruiser moored there right next to the ferry dock, and that is the historic Turner Joy that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But the second night of attack is unconfirmed. And yet, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is portrayed to the American Congress as an unprovoked and sustained attack by communist forces against Americans, and therefore Congress gives Lyndon Johnson that blank check of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving him free rein to do and to take any measures to defend American forces in the area. And so that is the beginning of direct American involvement in the war, because soon after, American bombs are falling now north of the DMZ, right, as punishment, so to say. What is not told to the public in the Gulf of Tonkin incident is that forces of the Democratic Republic had every reason to attack the Americans, because they had in fact come under attack in the nights, in those nights of the Gulf of Tonkin. Why? Because forces of the Republic, so ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN forces had in fact attacked outlying islands of the northern coast, where there were radar installations and military installations of the Democratic Republic, in an attempt to destroy them and sabotage them and to weaken the Democratic Republic. So you see here again a third example that the Republic was far from passive. It was also engaged in aggressive actions against the Democratic Republic, just like, of course, the Democratic Republic through the NLF was trying to destroy the Republic. But that was not mentioned to the American public, that in fact there were Republican attacks against the Democratic Republic, and the Americans were in fact out there in the Gulf of Tonkin to monitor these attacks and gain valuable intelligence. So this is not told to the American public, and my argument would be that this is in part because it would go against the American framing of a kind of passive quote-unquote South Vietnam that is now under aggressive attack by quote-unquote North Vietnam. So this is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. I'm happy to answer more questions later on if you want to know more about it, but as I said, this is a very selective lecture series about the Vietnam War, and I'm don't want to spend too much time on battles or these kind of individual events, but look at the bigger picture. But what happens after the Gulf of Tonkin incident is first, American bombs are falling north of the DMZ for the first time, and then in March 1965, we have US forces landing in Da Nang. So US forces are now coming into the country south of the DMZ and are rapidly built up. So between 1965 and 1967, so within 2 years, we have about 500,000 American forces in what the Americans called South Vietnam. So in the southern half of Vietnam now, American forces are taking over the fighting. They have lost confidence in the effectiveness of ARVN that they had supported since 1955, since 1961 with advisors as well. But obviously they had lost so much ground in the south to the NLF guerrillas that American forces were needed directly. So we come to a new phase of American involvement in 1965, direct intervention with military forces on the ground, very rapidly built up, and then basically taking over the main fighting responsibilities on the ground. Search and destroy operations, patrolling into VC-held countryside, a war that is based on numbers, on kill ratio, on body count, on this kind of, rather elusive tactical goals of the Americans. But that is the nature of warfare since 1965. So the NLF is now faced with a much more formidable conventional enemy, the American forces. And so as a counter-escalation, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which had until then supported the NLF as Southern guerrilla fighters, is now sending its army, its regular forces, south. So we call these the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN. Okay, so the People's Army of Vietnam, which are the regular forces of the Democratic Republic, and which had, as you know, in 1954-55, regrouped north into that northern recruitment zone, and therefore had no longer a presence there, which was exploited by the Republic. They are now being sent to reinforce Southern guerrilla fighters and loyalists to the revolution on the battlefields now that American forces are on the ground as well. So from 1965 on, we come to a new phase of the war, which is usually referred to as escalation phase, an escalation by American forces and a counter-escalation by the Democratic Republic with regular forces of the People's Army. This is 1967, so this is 2 years after the intervention of American forces, and you see two things. One is that the territorial control of the Republic in blue is now even more diminished from 1965, right? So this is 1965, Saigon, the Republic, ARVN controlled those blue areas, and this is 1967. 2 years after American intervention, the Vietnamese allies of the Americans, what they call South Vietnam, what Americans call South Vietnam, now hold on to even fewer slices of the territory south of the DMZ. So de facto, the archipelagos are shrinking. But something else is right there, and that is comparatively communist control of the southern half of Vietnam, now with the People's Army and the NLF together, is equally shrinking. It becomes more fragmented than in 1965. In 1965, there are whole areas of contiguous control. 1967, more fragmentation. And that clearly has to do with the effectiveness of American warfare in the countryside, which was particularly brutal, with overwhelming force. There's a lot of aerial bombardments, but also tactics to depopulate areas in the countryside that were so firmly in revolutionary pro-communist control that they could not be pacified. So American forces oftentimes then established so-called free fire zones. The tactic of depopulating whole areas, whole counties and districts in the countryside is part and parcel of American intervention, which, let me remind you, makes, of course, the suffering of people, particularly in the southern half of Vietnam, so much greater. So the level of violence that erupts now in southern countryside in the escalation phase of the war has now reached levels that were unprecedented, and that makes, in many areas of the countryside, survival practically impossible. So many Southerners in the countryside, rural population, are now forced out of the countryside and into the cities where they survive in very terrible situations, oftentimes in slums on the outskirts of the cities. They have been uprooted from the countryside because of these kind of very brutal American strategies of bringing the war to the insurgency. But you see that overall, it does not turn the tide of the war. It does not bring back further control of the republic. It just disrupts the previous more contiguous control of communist forces here 65, here in 1967. So we come to 1968 and the Tet Offensive. Okay. The Tet Offensive, Tet is the Vietnamese holiday of New Year, Lunar New Year, usually at the end of January, early February, depending on the moon calendar. And it is a big holiday in the Vietnamese calendar. And Vietnamese had already a precedence of a Tet Offensive that goes back to the 18th century, where Vietnamese forces used a surprise attack during the festivities of Tet to defeat a Chinese army that had come down from the north. That's in the 18th century. But Tet 1968 is also, there is a ceasefire or a truce for the Tet festivities, and in the under the guise of this truce, revolutionary forces are getting into position and attacking Republican areas south of the DMZ in full force. Now, militarily, that will become quite a bit of a disaster for revolutionary forces, because eventually the Americans in particular, but also ARVN, kind of overcome the initial shock and then push back. There are a lot of casualties on the revolutionary side. But there are 2 points I want to make for our purposes here to the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is widely successful in political terms. Why? Because even though militarily it did not defeat the Republic nor the Americans, that of course was never the ultimate goal of the offensive, because people in Hanoi are realistic enough to know that even the combined forces of the People's Army and the NLF will not be able to defeat the Americans. But it is a political victory because, in this case, the forces of the Democratic Republic have shown, particularly to the American public and to the American leadership, that this is not a winnable war. Now, why is this not a winnable war? Well, because we have to see again the distribution, the on-the-ground distribution of forces. And this one goes, in fact, the factual situation on the ground goes against the American framing of the war, that this was a separate South Vietnam that the Americans wanted to defend from communist aggression from the north. Now, who were the main forces on the revolutionary side who fought in the Tet Offensive 1968? It was in fact not the People's Army, but it was the NLF. So it was Southern guerrillas who were the ones who were mainly the ones who organized and executed the offensive, and therefore driving the point home that all these years of American intervention had not changed the basic setup, that there was a lot of southern resistance to the southern-based republic as well. Okay? And with that recognition, the war changes dramatically. Now, the Tet Offensive 1968 is, of course, still a very controversial subject matter. Historians are fighting all the time about the interpretation of 1968, and I don't really want to go into detail here, but I want to emphasize again that I think it is true to call this a turning point in the war. Why? Because until 1968, the American leadership was always talking about victory. Right? So there was light at the end of the tunnel, the enemy's on the ropes, we just need 5,000 more troops, and then we'll turn the corner and we will be able to have a South Vietnam, quote-unquote South Vietnam, that is free of communist menace. After 1968, American leadership no longer talks about victory, they talk about peace. They're trying to find peace. And in that rhetorical shift, I think you can see how fundamentally the war had shifted by 1968. So Tet 1968 was the moment where American escalation was no longer viable. Right? It drove the point home to American political and military leaders that this was not a war that was winnable by military means alone. There had to be some kind of a political process to bring about, not victory, but bring about peace with honor. A situation where American forces could now withdraw. Okay, so I want to interrupt this narrative before we get into the 1970s by drawing you another map. Okay, so here's your map, and I want to draw in, well now I have used blue, but I want to draw in a river just to make sure you get the point. And this one is actually not very good, but let me bring this. So, here we are. Can you identify this map? Okay, so I would like you to tilt your heads to the left by 90 degrees. Okay, so you see these are the lower 48s, okay? So, forgive me, it's a little bit, Florida is probably a little bit too fat up here, and you know, Texas probably has some problems too, but who cares, right? So the lower 48 of the United States, and I just want to impose, so to say, on the United States a similar rhetoric, a similar framing of the war that the United States imposed on their Vietnam War. Right? So the United States said there are two Vietnams, two discrete entities or countries. One is called North Vietnam and the other one is South Vietnam. And therefore, because revolutionaries, communists are active in South Vietnam, this is a North Vietnamese aggression or invasion, and we are there to support South Vietnam and stay a non-communist. And imagine that something like this was happening in the United States, right? So instead of the French occupying Vietnam as a colonial power, there might be Martians, right, who are controlling the United States. And eventually, this kind of foreign control is diminished and is reduced to the western half of the United States, west of the Mississippi, okay? And there, a counter-government to Washington is set up, say, in Los Angeles, okay? And now the United States Army, right? I mean, every red-blooded American patriot would, of course, find the control of, you know, Martians over the western half of the United States intolerable, and they would fight back, they would organize, and army units from based in Ohio or Maine or Florida or Georgia or Michigan would now be sent across the Mississippi to help American patriots fight against that Martian supported government in Los Angeles. Right? Now, this is all very hard to believe, but let's pretend this is going on. And the Martians would now call US forces, US Army forces that had come from East America to fight in West America, the so-called East American Army. And this is West America. And therefore, because this is the East American Army, it has no legitimate purposes in West America. In fact, it is an invading force. Okay? And you can see the absurdity, so to say, of that kind of rhetorical setup. Because everybody here in the United States would say, well, this is not the East American Army. We are the US Army, and we are legitimately operating in our own country. All happens to be in the western half of it to help other patriots fighting you guys. Right? Now, why do I have this kind of interlude of that kind of ridiculous American story? Because from 1965 on, when the People's Army of Vietnam began to operate not only just in the northern zone of Vietnam, but then also to infiltrate south to help the NLF, Southern Guerrilla Forces, against now the buildup of American forces. In our rhetoric, in our American rhetoric, not only do we have North Vietnam versus South Vietnam, but the People's Army of Vietnam is rhetorically referred to as the North Vietnamese Army in American framing. Okay? So you see that in the choice of terminology, we Americans have come to learn, have come to understand that in the Vietnam War there were two entities, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and that eventually the so-called North Vietnamese Army was infiltrating into South Vietnam, and therefore, because of the choice of terminology, because they're North Vietnamese Army, they have no business in South Vietnam, and therefore are aggressors, they are invaders, they're alien forces, they're not in their own country. But you know, of course, from our first lecture that Vietnam was indivisible as a core feature of Vietnamese nationalism of all parts, and for Northerners to go into the southern zone to help fight with the NLF against Americans was a kind of had no problem. It was their own country, and they were simply reacting to an escalation of military confrontation in the southern half of their country by the insertion of American forces, which required the insertion now of more and more regular forces of the Democratic Republic, the People's Army of Vietnam. Okay? So you see that terminology matters, and mapping matters. Right? So when I want to show you how the two states operate, we'll come up with this kind of double vision of a Vietnam that has, you know, two outlines to show you that from the Vietnamese point of view, they were two contending states, both exclusivist and eliminationist, and therefore operating in the southern half of their country was not an issue for those who believed in the revolutionary state. But in opposition to that, we have a map that now, an American map that says, this is North Vietnam, we won't bother with it, right, because we don't want to provoke the Chinese communists. But this is South Vietnam, it is separate, and therefore anybody who, other than the Arban, has no legitimate business there. Right? Because it's South Vietnam. Well, you know that even quote-unquote South Vietnam did not agree with that, because the Republic itself also claimed all of Vietnamese authority, made plans to eventually go north and destroy the Democratic Republic and reunite Vietnam under their prerogatives, just like their enemies did in the other way around. Okay? So I want to show you just a few screenshots of the recent Ken Burns series of the Vietnam War, and show you how terminology in this case, again, confirms an American framing of the war that did not correspond, in fact, with Vietnamese realities. Right, so here we have, in the Ken Burns series, an interview with a high-ranking general of the Army of the Republic, so the Saigon Army, and he's identified, Lang Quang Thi is identified by Ken Burns as South Vietnamese Army. Right? Now, you could argue, well, there wasn't just one South Vietnamese Army, because if you wanted to be a kind of a hair splitter, the NLF, of course, was also an army that was run by southern guerrillas, and therefore could also be called a South Vietnamese Army. But in the choice of this terminology, you see that an American framing is delegitimizing anybody else than the so-called South Vietnamese Army in the southern half of Vietnam, and gives it full legitimacy in the south. Now here you see another person, South Vietnamese Army, a South Vietnamese diplomat, as if in this kind of choice of terminology, South Vietnam as a separate political entity was a problemless notion. Well, you know, of course, from our meetings in the last 3 weeks, that this is not without problems, that it is in fact not how Vietnamese saw their situation. And here you have another, one of those that Ken Burns interviewed, and he is simply identified as North Vietnam. Now, I think this is in some ways disrespectful, because those who were Vietnamese nationalists did not necessarily identify themselves as a South Vietnamese or a North Vietnamese. They just happened to be from the north, say, but wanted to fight enemy forces in the southern half of their country. So to be reduced to North Vietnam and South Vietnam, I think does not capture that reality at all. Right? So here, just to give you these examples of Ken Burns' screenshots, and that is, in a nutshell, if you want to ask me later on about Ken Burns' Vietnam War series that was recently released in September last year, my disappointment with him is that he is unable to transcend these American framings and the terminology that we have come to so used to, and not able to open up rhetorically space for Vietnamese voices to be heard in their genuine context. All right, so I want to move on into the 1970s and the next stage of American involvement in Vietnam after Tet 1968 is what we usually refer to as Vietnamisation. Okay? So Vietnamisation is the American answer to Tet 1968. The Americans are realizing military victory alone is elusive. They have to do something about it. There is growing clamor back in the United States to bring the boys home. And so they're talking more about finding peace. And the answer to that, or the concept for that, is so-called Vietnamisation. Vietnamisation. And that is to build up armed forces once again. Remember, armed forces were relegated to kind of a secondary support role in the escalation phase, but to build up armed forces again so that American forces can be withdrawn over time as the American public and as Congress increasingly demands. And also the realities of the Vietnam War demands, because it now has an undue weight in the overall global footprint of American forces in the Cold War. So to withdraw American forces is a prerogative that is set up under so-called Vietnamisation. Now, Vietnamisation, if you wanted to see this as a kind of a very brief graphic, is basically the idea that you build up ARVN, and as ARVN is being built up, US forces are standing down. Right? So as ARVN is standing up, US forces can be withdrawn, standing down, and that means that over time, ARVN forces would more and more be able to take over main military responsibilities and then also defeat communist forces. Now a combination of southern-based NLF guerrillas and regular forces of the People's Army. Long story short, that does not happen. Okay? So the reality of Vietnamisation is that it starts out pretty optimistically. Their initial gains by 1970, 71 is already kind of a setback. 72, in the battles of 71, 72, it becomes clear that ARVN itself alone will not be able to hold its own against the combined forces of NLF and the People's Army of Vietnam. So those forces that are in support of the Democratic Republic and the Republican forces of the ARVN are not holding the line. So this is 1972 now, and Americans are desperate to get out of Vietnam. Right? American forces have been now withdrawn to under 100,000 troops in the country. Military morale is pretty bad among American forces. Congress and the public demand a withdrawal. The public has soured on the war, similar to how the French public had soured in the early 1950s on their war in Vietnam. And it's time to get out. So we get to the Paris Agreement of 1973. Before we get to that, I just want to give you one piece of the puzzle that is important to understand what happens in 1972. In 1971, the People's Republic of China and the Americans are finding a way to talk to one another. It starts with ping-pong diplomacy. Many of you will remember this. An American ping-pong team going to communist China to play ping-pong, and then soon after followed by Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State by that time, and who was talking with Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists. And then stunningly, in the winter months of 1972, Richard Nixon himself goes to Beijing and talks to Mao Zedong. Now that was very stunning, and it was a brilliant move by the Nixon administration, precisely because not only did it drive a wedge further between the communist superpowers, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, but for our purposes in the Vietnam War, American intervention had always been predicated on holding the line against further communist expansion. And communist expansion in the view of Washington, D.C., was not only communist Vietnamese, but behind them was communist China. And by warming relations between capitalist United States and communist China, the specter of Chinese expansionism was taken out of the equation. So in other words, Nixon's visit to Mao takes China out of the Vietnam equation and relegates Vietnam to a smaller regional war, not the flashpoint of the global Cold War. Right? And that leaves the Americans a way out, saving face, so to say, even if there was a setback. So as I said, by 1972 it becomes clear to the United States that ARVN alone will not do the job against the communist forces in the Vietnam, what is, for all intents and purposes, a Vietnamese civil war. So in 1972, that would be my argument, the American forces, the American government is now well aware that Vietnamisation ultimately will not succeed. And they see further down the horizon, and an unspecified future date, that most likely ARVN will be defeated by the People's Army and the NLF. So in this situation of two contending exclusivist and eliminationist states, what had already been suggested in 1954, the Democratic Republic will probably prevail over the Republic, and it will be able to destroy the Republic rather than the other way around, the Republic destroying the Democratic Republic. So at that point in 1972, Kissinger and a communist counterpart, Tet, they are negotiating in secret, mostly in Paris, over finding a way to come to a ceasefire and to kind of a political solution to the war. And I want to spend a little bit of time on these discussions and harken back to the Geneva Accords of 1954, which I have kind of beaten you over the head last week for quite a long time. But this is important. It was important because without understanding Geneva, you will not understand what happens here. Now, Kissinger and Tet had talked for years, and they had always been stymied over two demands that each side had raised that the other one was unable to accept. Kissinger had claimed that at the point of ceasefire, US forces would withdraw, but as a quid pro quo, the North Vietnamese army would have to withdraw from South Vietnam as well. And I put this all in quotation marks to underscore that this is, of course, a particular choice of terminology that Vietnamese would not accept, right? So here you see, of course, why Tet was adamant in not accepting that Kissinger requirement for a ceasefire. From an American point of view, that made total sense, because the Americans had set it up as a South Vietnam that is under North Vietnamese invasion, and therefore, if the Americans would have to withdraw, those alien forces of the North Vietnamese army would have to withdraw as well. But Vietnamese didn't think this way. The North Vietnamese army was actually the people's army, and it was operating in its own country, perfectly legitimate, and why would it have to withdraw its forces? That's number one. But secondly, and that is where Geneva comes in, you of course know what happened in Geneva. The Democratic Republic had agreed to the setup of two military regroupment zones, but only under the condition of reunification elections to overcome the division at the ballot box. And those elections have been denied by their enemy state in Saigon, and with support of the Americans. And as a result, no elections were held, and Southern loyalists to the revolutionary state were mercilessly hunted down and executed and imprisoned. So they had learned a very hard lesson from the late 1950s. We accepted the Geneva Accords, we withdrew our protective umbrella of our own forces to the northern zone, and left our supporters in the South unprotected. And our enemies in the Republic and the Americans were, well, they were screwing it, right? I mean, there's no other word for it. Right? They had, in fact, used the withdrawal of revolutionary forces from the South to go after the loyalists and not to hold elections. Okay? So this was a very bitter lesson that the communists had learned after Geneva, and therefore they would never again accept withdrawing their own forces from the southern half of what they saw as their own country and leaving all of their supporters once again unprotected, because they knew exactly what would happen. Right? So you have to understand that stalemate in the Kissinger-Tet talks, and Tet has a counter-proposal that Kissinger will never accept, and that is that at the point of ceasefire, he says the Republic has to be abolished, and the Saigon government has to be replaced by a neutralist government of all southern factions, including NLF. And of course, you know that this is unacceptable for Kissinger, who is, in a way, operating in a completely different frame about the war. The war was against North Vietnam against South Vietnam. South Vietnam was a legitimate country. It had a legitimate government that was supported by the United States. If the United States would accept Le Duc Thaw's demand that the Republican government would have to be abolished at the point of ceasefire, the whole rationale for American intervention in Vietnam would fly out the window. Right? So he can't accept that proposal by Le Duc Thaw. In 1972, as our fortunes are waning, and therefore American forces are increasingly desperate to leave the country, America wants to wash its hand of Vietnam, and warming relations with People's Republic of China allow a diplomatic way out, they too drop the demands. Okay, so we have a point forward leading to the Paris Agreement of 1973. And just like Geneva, it has two main provisions, a military provision and a political one. So the military provision, just like in Geneva, was a ceasefire. And you know how it was in Geneva, right? Two military recruitment zones, the French and ASVN forces move south, the People's Army moves north, and you know, of course, what happened that would make it impossible for the communists to agree to that again. The ceasefire is now a US withdrawal, and all the Vietnamese forces would remain in situ, right? So Latin, in place. In other words, there would be a ceasefire that would look like something like this. Right? So the reality of an archipelago state of the Republic would continue with interspersed areas under communist control. Right? Everybody would lay down their weapons, and that would be the ceasefire. Oftentimes referred to as leopard skin, right, or leopard spot. Okay? So this is the ceasefire agreement of 1973. And now you understand why Geneva plays a big role in that, because it was necessary. It vanished on me. It was necessary for American withdrawal to concede on this point, because Kissinger realizes that the revolutionaries will never accept again to withdraw their support from their protective shield from their supporters in the South. Just like in Geneva, there was a second provision, and that was a political solution after ceasefire. And in Geneva, that political solution was, we go to the ballot, and we decide at the ballot box, one person, one vote, which of the two contending states will win. Well, you know what the fate was of those elections, they were never held. But similarly, here in Paris 1973, a political solution is that there would be a non-governmental entity in the South, in Saigon, that would have representatives of the Republic, of the NLF, and so-called neutralists, third force people who were neither loyalists to the revolutionary state nor to the Republican state. And they would then come together and establish a path forward for all South Vietnamese elections to neutralize a government. So the Republic continues, but there would be a non-governmental organization, including the NLF and neutralists, who would set a date and organize elections of all Southerners that would create a neutral government that would eventually talk with Hanoi about reunification. Okay? So Le Duc Tho has dropped this demand, but he has conceded that the Republic has a certain legitimate role to play in the political solution of the war, but my argument is he can do so because The main goal was to get the United States out of Vietnam, because now everybody realizes in a military showdown, ARVN will not prevail against the People's Army and the NLF. So this is the Paris Agreement 1973, and just like in Geneva 1954, the Republic, the allies of the United States, and in 1954 allies of the French, are refusing to implement the political solution. Right? Clearly it is not going in their direction, and so the Republic, in fact, while signing the agreement, within days declares that it will not honor the political solutions of that overcoming that ceasefire. Okay, so let me see where I am in time-wise. I want to very briefly bring you bring you to 1975, and then show you some final imagery of mapping and make my final argument about terminology and mapping. Right? Because now we have a rather straightforward narrative. Americans have withdrawn by early 1973 in the wake of the Paris Agreement. We have a leopard skin map. So this is 1967. I would argue in 1973 the map is not substantially any different from this one. A leopard skin of intertwined forces, the Republic holding on to an archipelago of places, mainly the towns and cities, and a little bit of countryside. Much of the countryside is otherwise controlled by communist guerrillas and the People's Army of Vietnam. Now, the Republic has made it clear that it will not honor any of a political roadmap towards overcoming the conflict. And in fact, so the two sides, of course, break the ceasefire, they go back to fighting, and eventually, in 1975, that situation is turning decisively in the communist favor, and the Republic is destroyed. Saigon is overrun in April 30, 1975. Remember, this is not something that I wanted to get into, the kind of nitty-gritty of the war stories. That's a pretty straightforward stories. Again, very tragic. You know, hundreds of thousands of people will die again. Civilians, first and foremost, affected. The war leaders on all sides, of course, very hard-nosed, cynical, knowing that they will send so many people to their death. This is not the subject of this talk, okay? But I want us to remember that. But again, the narrative here is, in American discourses, that with the Americans out, it was, in fact, the communists of quote-unquote North Vietnam that violated the ceasefire and then invaded South Vietnam in 1975, and the dagger was finally put in the heart of the Republic, and it vanished, right? So these are the kind of rhetorical frames in which Americans are still talking about the war. And I want to show you now, in conclusion, how this is depicted, the final offensive in 1975. Now, keep in mind this map, right? This is the reality, not only in 67, but I would argue in 73, 74 as well. But in the American framing, we are thinking of this as a homogeneous South Vietnam, right? That is then deviously invaded by the communists, and they are overthrowing them because the Americans have withdrawn. Kissinger has kind of given away the farm, so to say, in the negotiations with Little Tom. He has not insisted on having the so-called NVA move north, and all of that. So this is the situation in 1975 when the final offensive is being launched by the People's Army against the ARVN. And so I want to show you still photos, screenshots from the 1984 PBS series on the war in Vietnam, Vietnam, a television history. I think actually it's not a bad depiction of the war, but again, its deeper framing of the war is alongside American narratives. Right? And here you see the situation in early March 1975, so before the outbreak of the final offensive that will topple the Saigon government. And you see that it is depicting Vietnam in very straightforward, homogeneous two parts, right? So you see the kind of northern sliver of what is in American rhetoric is called North Vietnam, and then a homogeneous yellow area that is called South Vietnam. Keep in mind, this is not the reality, of course. The reality was that the Republic was an archipelago state and that a lot of People's Army forces and the NLF were in control of much of the territory south of the DMZ. But this is how it is depicting the offensive in 1975. And here's a screenshot from just a few seconds later. And you see that the Republic is now losing a lot of territory, which is now depicted as black, and regroups further south, and that is forlorn, last-minute attempt to survive, and it will not work. But here again, it is a very straightforward narrative. Right? Revolutionary forces that were not in this area south of the DMZ are now suddenly in charge. They come from somewhere, and then in this southern half is still the Republic. Well, we also know that, of course, large tracts of the Mekong Delta and other areas down here were also under revolutionary control. Right? So you see that in this kind of map representation of the war, we are led to believe things that in reality did not, in fact, occur. Now, let me go to 2014 and to a documentary by Rory Kennedy, Last Days in Saigon, which is falling exactly in this kind of American framing and misrepresentation of reality on the ground in Vietnam. Right? So here it posits that on March 10, 1975, North Vietnam launched a massive invasion into South Vietnam. Right? So the East American Army is invading West America. Right? So a straightforward American framing of the war that bears no relationship to the realities in which Vietnamese were framing their efforts in the war. It gives a very precise date, which is not correct, right? The revolutionary offensive starts in January, in fact, in the southern province. But here it is North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and invasion. Okay? And here is, now we are 30 years later, right? The maps have become much more sophisticated, digitalized, so there's a digital map depicting, again, North Vietnam as a homogeneous red country north of the DMZ, and then a homogeneous yellow that depicts then South Vietnam as if this was the reality for the two Vietnamese states and the reality of military force distribution, which is not true, as you know. But Rory Kennedy now depicts the narrative of a North Vietnamese invasion into South Vietnam in very stark terms of a red ooze invasion into the South, similar to the 1950s kind of propaganda at the height of the Cold War of kind of red ooze oozing over borders and taking over the territory. And I just want to show you, in kind of 1 second steps, how this works, right? You see the kind of red ooze going from the DMZ and gobbling up southern territory that is called South Vietnam. So this is where I want to leave you by summing up a few of the things that I tried to say in our 3 meetings over the last 3 weeks. Here you have a very good example of how American framing that we're so used to when we talk about the Vietnam War is in fact obscuring the realities on the ground. Right? There was no North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Vietnamese of all stripes, mortal enemies, mind you, Vietnamese of all stripes were agreeing that Vietnam was indivisible. There was not a distinct Vietnamese country that was called North Vietnam, nor a discrete country of South Vietnam. But more importantly, if we fall back into this rhetoric and into this terminology, we are left with exactly what Rory Kennedy has done. We are left with depicting falsely a homogeneous southern Vietnamese half that is invaded by North Vietnam, because in this framing there is no place for allowing the kind of much more complicated military map of South Vietnam with intertwined forces that have very real roots in nationalist ideology, but also in the military events over the last 30 years. And my last point here is, Julia, when she invited me to give these talks, Julia Wan, she asked me for a map, and I was not a very good correspondent, I have to say. I let this lie around in my inbox for a while, and so she took matters into her own hand. And maybe some of you have seen the poster for this series of lectures. It has an ugly photo of me, but more importantly, she, of course, took from the internet somewhere a map of Vietnam to illustrate what this talk is about. And and of course, 95% of the maps that you find of Vietnam in wartime fall back to the American framing of the war. All right? So if you go back to the poster for this lecture series, you will see a typical American map of Vietnam. The DMZ is depicted as a political border. Everything north of that is called North Vietnam. Everything south of that is called South Vietnam. And it is in nice homogeneous terms with the kind of infiltration routes from north to south, indicating the invasion of the North Vietnamese communists into South Vietnam. So what I have hoped to do over 3 meetings with you is to give you a much more complex reading of the war, particularly focused on the very diverse ways in which Vietnamese fell into political camps, but in also the way that they, even though mortal ideological enemies, agreed on a fundamental fact that Vietnam was indivisible, that it was never divided into different political countries. Okay? It was ultimately a civil war between 2 versions of nationalism, one a more communist-leaning one that found expression in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the other one, an anti-communist one, authoritarian as well, but anti-communist, that found expression in the setup of first the Associated State and then the Republic in 1955. And both of them want to eliminate the other. There's no doubt about it. Here again, contrast that to the American framing, a passive, peace-loving South Vietnam that is invaded by quote-unquote North Vietnam and has to be defended by American intervention. Okay? So all of this leads me to say, don't trust maps. Maps are not neutral, and maps have very deeply embedded political narratives to them. Right? And I wanted to show you this with the example of the much more complex situation of the Vietnam War than we are used to understanding and debating. So thank you very much for being very patient with me.
Thank you, Professor. We have a little bit of time for some questions, if anybody would like. Wow. Okay, we'll start all the way in the back, and we'll work to the front. How about that? Okay. Dr. Dillon.
I am a dubious Vietnam War veteran in the Air Force. And of course, we bombed the daylights out of North Vietnam and of the communist forces. And then Kissinger made Time magazine saying peace is at hand. And indeed, there seemed to be peace. Then Congress passed the War Powers Act. And lo and behold, Nixon could no longer bomb North Vietnam. And all hell broke out in the South in Vietnam. You did not comment on the War Powers Act. It actually is very pertinent to today because politics in the United States affects, obviously, our international actions and what have you. And politics in the United States certainly blew up the Vietnam War and Kissinger's peace at hand.
Yes.
Would you comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. So again, this fell victim to the time constraints, and it was not particularly germane to the overall I wanted to make. But it's very clear that in 1972, late 1972, the situation on the battleground is such that Kissinger and Nixon really clearly see that they need to leave Vietnam. It is not going to have a happy ending, and they have to find a way out. And the way out is the Paris Agreement, which solves nothing between the warring Vietnamese parties, but allows the Americans a face-saving exit of the war. So I haven't made this clear enough. But if you want to press me as a kind of a, pithy one-sentence explanation for Paris, 73, that is it. It was an agreement that allowed the Americans to exit the war with a face-saving agreement, but did not solve anything when it came to the Vietnamese warring parties. Okay? War Powers Act, of course, it's the Congress fed up finally with Nixon saying no more bombing of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam by the summer of 1973. Now, would that have made any difference if it hadn't happened? Would Nixon have been able to re-intervene to save the skin of the Republic? I have my grave doubts about that, because it was very clear that Vietnam, but by late 1972, the Nixon administration is washing its hands of Vietnam. It has warmed relations with the People's Republic of China. That is a much bigger accomplishment, and therefore Vietnam it can be relegated to a smaller setback and not the kind of central affair in the global war. Nixon is, of course, increasingly in trouble politically because of Watergate hearings and the looming impeachment eventually. I think leadership in Hanoi knew perfectly well that the chance of an American reintervention was close to zero. And whether or not the War Powers Act has played a role in it, it certainly further constrained American leadership flexibility. But ultimately, my sense is that neither Congress nor the American public nor the military leadership itself was willing to re-intervene in Vietnam, and again bogged down in a conflict that nobody in America wanted to have anything to do with anymore. Allies in Saigon, the Republican allies of the United States, of course, were bitterly disappointed. They felt betrayed, and there's a good amount of truth to that. That they felt that the United States had left them hanging. But my argument here is it is not something that was inevitable. It was something that was looming since 1955. The southern-based states simply had not as good cards in their hands as the northern-based Democratic Republic. So that is my long-winded answer to your question. I hope I answered it.
Do you have a reference or two for any of us that might want to pursue some further reading on this?
Pierre Asselin has just come up with a textbook that is of decent quality. We usually, university professors are never happy with any textbook because we never can agree on everything. But Pierre Asselin is Quebecois, so French sounding name. Pierre Asselin, I think it's called The American War in Vietnam. That's a rather new textbook that is pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. I also would say in the early 90s there was a book by William Diker, also a textbook called Sacred War, that is also a little bit more attuned to the various ways in which Vietnamese were conceptualizing of their war and tried to break through the American framing of it. So both of those are pretty good options.
Thank you. I wanted to get back to the poster. When I saw that poster, I thought if Ken Burns had copyrighted it, he would have used that in his video. What is your opinion? Is this the perfect Ken Burns poster?
So if you press me on evaluating the Ken Burns series, then I would say it's pretty good in its later parts. when it focuses in particular on the battle experience of American soldiers, so it is really a focus on the American experience in Vietnam. It has a little bit of a flourish of Vietnamese voices around it. But as I showed you in my screenshots from the series, Ken Burns is not willing to break out of American framing of the war, right? So here are South Vietnamese and there are North Vietnamese, and they never come together. So the first episode of the Ken Burns series, in which he lays the kind of historical ground for, be careful with mine, in which he lays the historical ground for American intervention by 1961, I think is particularly bad because he is either unwilling or completely unaware of how manipulative or one-sided American terminology in the Vietnam War is. And he uses it without any sense of criticality. So it is all about American invasion, it's all about there's North Vietnam and there's South Vietnam, and therefore we can call them the North Vietnamese Army and the South Vietnamese Army. This is something that I think is the major weakness of Ken Burns, that he is unwilling or unable to give that kind of space for Vietnamese voices to be heard objectively.
We have time for one more.
Okay, two more, because you had your hand up for a long time as well. Yeah, so we'll get to you as well.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, not sure it's worth waiting this long, but the question I have has got to do with how do the U.S. policymakers really think they were improving U.S. strategic interests by going there? Because in some ways, the way you talk about it, it sounds like it's almost just moralistic. Those guys in the South are the white hats, and we should get in there and help them.
Yes.
But there's got to be strategic interests that were at stake, and otherwise they wouldn't have committed that much.
Well, as I said last week, the unspoken assumption by many participants in the Geneva Accords, in the Geneva Conference, was that at that point the United States is the one source of instability in the world. Right? For various reasons, Soviet Union wanted détente. At this point, the British were not interested in any ratcheting up of tensions in the world. It is in that particular moment of early 1950s Cold War, McCarthyism, the decision of various US presidents to become much more aggressive in the world and enforce American interests, even if it meant overthrowing democratically elected governments in other countries, that I think determines American policy in Vietnam as well. Right? There was a domino theory. We're not giving another square yard of territory over to the communists. We're going to hold the line, and Vietnam is the perfect way to do that. Right? It is closely related to the experience of South and North Korea. We were back at the 38th parallel, and by God, we're not going to give the communists any more territory. So yes, I think that is the driving force behind the initial involvement of the Americans in what they call South Vietnam. So you see that it betrays already the kind of mindset. Here's a South Vietnam that is separate from North Vietnam, and we're going to hold the line there. So it is this weird combination of belligerence, but also idealism, right? Of genuinely believing they were doing something good for the South Vietnamese. Right? So it is this typical 1950s, 60s, almost a little bit naive belief in the goodness of your cause, and yet really underneath is also a deep-seated belligerence in international affairs. Okay.
We do one more?
And this is the last one. You had your hand up.
Well, I think you kind of answered it. The question was, is the U.S. position on Vietnam just a continuation of the attitude that we developed after Korea?
I believe yes, right? So the framing of the Vietnam War in American rhetorics is basically a continuation of what happened in Germany and in Korea, right? Cold War forces coming together directly after 1945, And the best way to resolve these different claims to influence is by dividing the territory, right? East Germany, West Germany, North Korea, South Korea, bang, we're done. What I was trying to do in this series of lectures is to show you that Vietnam, in fact, did not fall at all into the German and Korean model, because there was an independent Vietnamese state since 1945 that was confronted by a returning French colonial power, and only by 1949 will, in fact, two Vietnamese states emerge. But here, not in the German-Korean model of territorial political division, but in a model in which there was no political division, but eventually, after Geneva, a territorial partition into regroupment zones that were clearly connected to a political solution that never was allowed. Right? So that is the big difference from Korea and Germany. Germans and Koreans never really had a say in this, whereas Vietnamese, for at least 4, if not 9 years, 45 to 1954, certainly were in charge of their own fate until the Cold War fully imposes itself on them. Good.
Professor, on behalf of Mirabella, I would like to thank you. I think all of us have found this very illuminating. I know I have.
Thanks for having me.